Hello and welcome to the Project Doctor podcast. My name is Ralph Goossens and I'm your project management expert, presenting you with all the things you need to know about project management. Project Doctor is here to provide you with expert analysis and with recipes that you can put to practical use immediately after the podcast, so stay tuned. I'm very glad to hear that so many of you have already shown up. So let's get started right away. This is episode 7 of our podcast where we discuss the project canvas. And in this session, I'm going to talk about the sponsor or patron for the project. Obviously, without a sponsor, there's no project at all. So do keep listening for my tips on interacting with your sponsor. And visit our website projectdoctor.online to download the extras that also go with this episode. As I've been saying, no project starts moving without a sponsor. It's she or he who commissions the project, and sponsors are actually also the reason why you do have a job as a project manager in the first place. Now let me start by checking out the different roles that sponsors can assume. First and foremost, of course, the sponsor is the person who wants the project to happen. So we could say that the goal of the project is something that the sponsor wants. And I've been talking about the goal in the second episode. Sponsor is the person who wants the project to happen, who is really the ultimate sponsor. She or he is the initiator of the project. Then there are a few more sponsor roles. There could be the person who pays for the project budget. That's also a sponsor. And it's not necessarily the same person as the ultimate sponsor. The larger the organization where your project is running, the more different sponsor roles you could see. And a third one, another common sponsor role, is the person who overviews the project on a more or less daily or weekly basis. She or he has the delegated sponsorship, and they might be on the steering committee. This will be the person to whom you as a project manager are reporting on a regular basis, and probably it's the person that you will be communicating or interacting with the most. As an example of these project roles, in one project that I did, all 3 of the ones were present. This was in an international retail group, and the ultimate sponsor was the CEO of the group. He was located in the headquarters in Amsterdam. He initiated what was actually a whole series of projects to renew the core application in several retail chains that were owned by the group in various countries across Europe. In the second role, there was the paying sponsor, who was the CIO of the group. Because this was an IT project, obviously, the budget came out of the group IT department. And then there was the delegated sponsor. She was the managing director of the retail chain in one of the countries. I was interacting mostly with the delegated sponsor and occasionally also with the paying sponsor. Actually, I've never met the ultimate sponsor of this project. Such a distance is in the nature of these sponsor roles. They are linked to the corporate hierarchy. And that also brings with it the power dynamics and the politics that belong to any organization. And the bigger the club, the more dynamic the powers and the politics are. I mentioned earlier the link with a steering committee. So while the sponsor is a person, the steering committee obviously is an organizational group with a well-defined role and a mandate. The steering committee is the group of people who are supervising the project progress and the risks on a regular basis, every week, every month, and they do that on behalf of the ultimate sponsor. This means that if I, as a project manager, must escalate something, the first level will be to the steering committee, and this group will then decide if they can handle the situation themselves or need to escalate even further. As another example, in the same project that I was mentioning before, there was a problem with one of the suppliers. They could not deliver on time. So I brought this issue to the steering committee, and the managing director, as mentioned, who was the delegated sponsor, decided that this could be handled by themselves and that she only needed to inform the delay to the CIO, who was the paying sponsor, because the additional external costs in hiring consultants a bit longer for the duration of the delay could well be absorbed within the budget. There was a buffer for some contingency. This way, the steering committee basically absorbed the first level of escalation. Next, I want to talk about the relationship between you, the project manager, and the sponsor that you interact with most frequently. I will skip now the relationship with the more remote sponsors in situations where there are multiple roles and some of the sponsor roles are by their nature, or maybe rather by the nature of the organization, much more at a distance. But attention, there is also a situation where the sponsor is at a distance, while this should not be the case. And I'll talk about that in a bit because it's a problem situation that you will have to deal with. The most important factor in your relation with the sponsor is trust. And I think every language will have some proverbs about trust, which are equivalent to trust arrives on foot but leaves on horseback. You'll get the point. It takes time and effort to build and to maintain trust, and you can very, very quickly lose it. Stephen Covey Jr. has written on trust, and an important lesson that I learned from his book, The Speed of Trust, is that it works like oil to the wheels. Both communication and coordination are much easier, which means faster, more effective, more efficient when there is trust. So trust is a very important factor also in terms of achieving your results and in having or not having extra overhead cost in your project. Now, if you think back about the canvas, and this podcast series is about the project canvas, you would notice that there are two round areas. There is an area of coordination on the left side between deliverables and team and requirements. And there is a circle area called communication, or it's about communication, on the right side. And it's between the sponsor, the end user, and third parties. And these areas are actually the linking pin areas from the canvas. On the left side, linking the hard skill tiles, and on the other side, the soft skills tiles. So that means that even exercising the hard skills of project management becomes much more easier with trust and more difficult without trust, because that side is coordination, and also, as mentioned, coordination is definitely easier if there is a good and high level of trust. The second important factor in your relationship with the sponsor is power. Because by definition, the sponsor has power over the project, because she or he is the one who started the project, the ultimate sponsor, or holds the budget for it, the paying sponsor, or has the delegated authority to overview it on a daily or weekly basis. That means that for any problems that you cannot solve yourself within the project and that are a serious risk to the outcome or the potential benefits or the business case, you escalate to the sponsor, because that's the person who will have the power to do something, to do some intervention that might resolve the problem. That is, of course, outside any force majeure that is even beyond the influence of the sponsor. In any case, every sponsor will require reporting on the status and progress of the project and on risks as they evolve. All in all, keeping up a good line of communication with the sponsor will help you to manage expectations. And that again relates very much back to the issue of trust that I talked about just now. Because sponsors don't like surprises. They delegate a lot of authority to you as a project manager to handle the stuff for them. And they very well understand that things won't go as planned and that all kinds of shit will happen. It's just that sponsors, and I think people in general for that matter, do like it when they feel that they have some room for action, some agency, as it's called, which means that basically shit is okay as long as you see it coming, because that gives you the opportunity to think about it and to react. But when it hits you without any prior warning, that is bad, because then you're surprised and you can only act after the fact. So to keep the trust of your sponsor, it's much better to give early warning and discuss possible course of action than to keep silent and not broach the subject, because in the end, shit will hit the fan. But the way in which you manage the expectations is very important, and I'd like to tell a little story to make that clear. Because depending on culture, the way that you do broach the subject of any risk or issue may make a very big difference. The Dutch way, which is in your face, is certainly not always the best way, as I have found out with some pain. I was running a project in Belgium, and this problem happened to me big time. There were huge issues with the main IT system supplier in the project, leading to significant delays and cost overruns, and in my opinion at least also a serious risk of the software not even meeting the functionalities that were required and even laid down in the contract. In this project there were two sponsors in the steering committee: the paying sponsor, who was the country CEO, and the delegated sponsor, who was both the country and the group CIO. The ultimate sponsor was the CEO of the group, but I never met him, also in that situation. My main communications, almost daily, was with the delegated sponsor, and I had very little contact with the paying sponsor. However, the paying sponsor and the delegated sponsor had a lot of interaction with each other, and they were very well aware of the risks with that supplier. Now, my idea was to bring the topic of that risk to the table in the steering committee meetings where they both were. So that looked to me like the best place to discuss the item. But as it turned out, that was actually the worst place to discuss it, because this was Belgium. Because raising an issue in public means that someone is losing face, and such stuff had to be handled in the corridors and the side rooms. Even an update of the budget baseline or the planning was not something that was to be discussed in the steerco. It was only to be mentioned after it was agreed over a good dinner. So I failed there trying to manage expectations. Not because I was hiding the problem, but because I was bringing it out in the wrong way. As the French say, c'est le ton qui fait la musique. So let's finalize this episode with some sponsor problems. As with the story I just told, the first problem has already been covered, the culture gap between the sponsor and the project manager. Some other common problems that you may encounter could be that the sponsor is too much at a distance from the project. This can quite easily happen when the ultimate sponsor and the paying sponsor are in larger organizations. And even the delegated sponsor can keep a distance and be difficult to communicate with for you as project manager. This is a potential problem because it makes it much harder to do proper expectation management or to escalate in the case of a real issue. Another problem might be that the sponsor is inactive or maybe not even interested or committed to the project. That can quite easily happen with a delegated sponsor when the project has been forced upon them and they really have no real interest in it and they have other priorities to focus their attention to. Again, this is something that might happen in bigger or bureaucratic organizations. Another common thing is conflict of interest, which is that your project may be competing for budget, resources, or attention with another project, or maybe multiple projects, that the sponsor is also responsible for. She must then decide which one to give priority, and this may hurt the project that you happen to be managing. In such a case, make sure to do very good expectation management. You must accept that your sponsor gives lower priority to whatever you're handling, and then indicate the consequences for your project, which likely will be accepted in view of the priorities that the sponsor actually has. Then finally, there are personal career motives of the sponsor. This is kind of an indirect problem, where being the sponsor for your project might be only a stepping stone for them on their way to the next career move. And that might lead them to focus very much on one single aspect of the project, which has visibility for their boss and no interest at all in anything else that's going on inside your project, because they're focusing on what's needed for their CV only. Again, do make sure that your expectation management is very proper, and do choose wisely what to escalate and what not. Okay, so as a summary, what have we covered in this episode? I've been discussing about the various roles that the sponsor can have: the ultimate sponsor, the paying sponsor, or the delegated sponsor. I've talked about the special relationship between a project manager and a sponsor, where trust and power and good expectation management are key topics. And we've covered a few problematic situations that you can come across. And I've given an example from my own life experience of the culture gap. But other issues might be a distance or disinterest or different priorities. All right, if you've liked all of this, please also go to projectdoctor.online, download the extra materials that you can find there, and do subscribe and follow this podcast so that you don't have to miss an episode. Please find some time to leave a comment and a review. I'll be very, very happy to hear from you. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.